It's 1965, and the Walt Disney Company is dominating American culture. Over the past 15 years, movies like Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, 101 Dalmatians, and most recently Mary Poppins have taken the box office by storm. Meanwhile, the introduction of Disneyland has revolutionized the amusement park industry, becoming the new gold standard of themed entertainment. But the limited space in Anaheim, as well as the lack of control on the region surrounding the park, prompted Walt Disney to dream bigger. Walt began the search for a new region to start fresh with the Disneyland concept, landing on a large patch of land in Central Florida. Walt began work on his new Disney World, but at age 64, Walt had begun to reflect on the impact he'd made on American culture. He was known as a showman, America's greatest entertainer, but Walt felt this was too small a legacy. He had bigger aspirations, grander ideas for a beautiful tomorrow, which led to his work on Epcot, a full-scale city meant to revolutionize the concept of the modern community. This city of tomorrow was meant to be Walt's shining achievement and place him among the ranks of the great American pioneers. There was only one problem: Walt's brother, Roy Disney. While Walt was the creative visionary, pushing animation and themed entertainment forward, Roy was the one who focused on finances and logistics. And the logistics of building a city of tomorrow were not all coming together. There were questions regarding human rights and governance, questions that Walt had little interest in finding answers for. This wasn't the first time Roy had voiced concerns about one of Walt's dreams. When Walt went to work making the first animated feature film, Roy didn't think it would make its money back. When Walt wanted to build Disneyland, Roy didn't think it would work. And Roy had pressing logistical concerns about Epcot, which led to tensions between the two brothers. Throughout the years, executives in the company had begun to take sides in the ongoing feud between the two, becoming known as Walt men or Roy men. The divisions between the two had started as small cracks when developing Snow White, but those cracks had grown, slowly forming into a chasm dividing each side of the Disney family. As Epcot continued development, it seemed tensions may finally snap soon enough. But unfortunately, the issues between Walt and Roy were never addressed. On December 15, 1966, Walt Disney tragically passed away. Walt had been dealing with lung cancer for some time, a fact that many in the company were unaware of. Although Walt never got to create his city of tomorrow, he still left a legacy that would be enviable to most. He'd raised the bar for practically every form of entertainment he ever worked in, being remembered as a visionary pioneer. And although he'd never built his city, Walt had left behind an empire, the Walt Disney Company, a living legacy of his own. Once, Walt had been asked if he'd consider running for mayor of Los Angeles. Walt responded, quote, "Why would I run for mayor when I'm already king?" In a way, he was right. Walt and Roy had built a massive organization from the ground up, and had become twin kings of their own sort of kingdom. But with the creativity of Walt suddenly gone, there was a void that needed to be filled if the company was to survive. For a time, Roy filled that void himself. Roy had planned to retire soon, being 78 years old, but he put off those plans to finish building Walt Disney World and make some of his brother's vision come to reality. And only 3 months after the park opened, Roy himself would sadly pass away. The question remained: who would take the reins in the absence of the Disney brothers? Who was capable of ascending to the throne? This is the story of those who attempted, failed, and succeeded. These are the kings of the Magic Kingdom. Episode 1: Inheriting the Legacy. Above all, there was one man most concerned with protecting the legacy of Walt Disney. His name was Roy Disney Jr. Roy Jr. was the son of Roy Disney Sr. and nephew to Walt Disney. Growing up, Roy Jr. had been very close with his uncle Walt, with the two sharing an interest in creative storytelling. As a child, Roy Jr. enjoyed when Walt would read him storybooks, acting out each scene in dramatic fashion. Roy cherished these moments long into his adulthood, and once said that he was disappointed by the Disney release film Pinocchio, since it never lived up to Walt's own telling of the story. In his teen years, Roy Jr. found a new shared interest with his uncle Walt: trains. Walt had developed a bit of an obsession for locomotives, building a 1:8 scale train with tracks cutting through his entire yard, much to the disdain of Walt's wife Lillian, who was planning to build a garden. Walt and Roy Sr. had been neighbors for years, and their children spent a lot of time together. But even when they moved to different neighborhoods, Roy Jr. still made time to visit his uncle and ride the train together. In his adulthood, Roy Jr. had gone to work at the company, pursuing his interest in storytelling. He began working as a director on a number of nature films, stylized similarly to the work of Walt and the rest in the company. Due to his love for the company and his respect for Walt and his work, it may be fair to assume that Roy Jr. was next in line to take over leading Walt Disney Productions, but in reality, not so much. Although Roy Jr. did his best to keep a close relationship with his uncle Walt, as stated, the relationship between Walt and Roy Sr. was not doing well as the years had gone by. Issues over Roy Sr.'s apprehension in making Snow White, Disneyland, and Epcot were just the beginning of the problems. In fact, while the uncle and nephew bonded over their love for locomotives, trains were a bit of a sore subject between Roy Sr. and Walt. Although Disneyland was owned by the company, Walt himself had managed to retain personal ownership of the Disney Railroad and the planned monorail, forcing Walt Disney Productions to pay royalties to Walt. And that wasn't all. Walt's personal companies had managed to copyright the name of the man himself, meaning Walt Disney Productions had to pay royalties for the use of Walt Disney's name. Roy Sr. found this especially frustrating, since the original name of the company was the Disney Brothers Studio. Although they had changed it, since Walt was the creative face of the company, it was still supposed to be their company, not just Walt's. Eventually, Walt Disney Productions bought back Walt's personal companies and the rights to use of the names and assets, and Walt gave Roy Sr. a wooden peace pipe as a symbol of their reconciliation. But their relationship was never truly the same, and Roy Sr. worried his son would not be treated well within the company. And unfortunately, he wasn't entirely wrong. Roy Jr. was a shy and reserved man. He had ambitions as a storyteller of his own, but his goals were sometimes outshined by his quiet personality, and Walt seemed to perceive this as a lack of drive and strength of character. When Roy Jr. married Patty Daly in 1955, Walt said, quote, "Great news, my nephew's marrying a girl with some spunk." Walt confided to E. Carden Walker, the manager of ads and public relations, about his lack of faith in Roy Jr., saying that Roy would, quote, "never amount to anything." This led Card Walker to dub Roy the Idiot Nephew, a moniker that would float around the company for years to come. Instead of setting up Roy Jr. as his successor, Walt had his eye on his son-in-law, Ron Miller. Ron, a football player for the LA Rams, had married Walt's daughter, Diane Disney, in 1954. Ron was also a little shy and not too well-spoken, but rather than seeing this as a weakness, Walt saw Ron as somebody with promise, and someone who could be molded into a worthy successor. Diane once said of Ron, quote, "I think Dad was thrilled with the way Ron came along and grasped the business. And actually, Ron had no training for anything else. He was like a blank notebook. Dad could take him and mold him in his pattern. I think the nicest thing I ever did for Dad was that through some quirk of fate, I was able to marry a man who fit into Dad's dream." Walt brought Ron into the company in various roles throughout the years, helping him quickly rise in the ranks. After the death of Roy Sr., Don Tatum took the reins for 5 years, moving forward on many plans in animation and the theme parks that were in place prior to his arrival. Then, in 1976, Card Walker took over as CEO, and later as chairman in 1980, with Ron Miller serving as his president. At one point, Roy Sr. had unsuccessfully attempted to fire Ron Miller, which created further animosity between the Walt and Roy sides of the family. Because of these tensions and the negative perception of Roy Jr. from within the company, Ron and Card never seemed to really respect Walt's nephew. Although Roy Jr. was the largest individual shareholder in the company, holding 3%, the Walt side of the family owned a collective 11%, empowering Card and Ron to shoot down any creative suggestions that Roy made. Conversely, Roy was very popular with Disney fans, and played well at park and company events whenever he made appearances. After all, he had the Disney name, and happened to look a little bit like Walt Disney himself. But despite being a board member and holding a substantial stake in the company, he retained very little decision-making power. It was for these reasons that, at the suggestion of his lawyer and business partner Stanley Gold, Roy left behind his creative ambitions within the company to become an independent producer. The two founded Shamrock Holdings to manage Roy's assets, and Roy distanced himself from the company he had dedicated his life to. He cited his belief in the lack of creative vision in current leadership as the reason for his departure, and he wasn't the only one who felt this way. During this period, Disney Animation released Robin Hood, The Rescuers, and Pete's Dragon, while Disney's live-action releases were Freaky Friday, a couple of Herbie sequels, and The Black Hole. Some of these were successful, while others, particularly Pete's Dragon and The Black Hole, were considered failures. But despite a few successes, many animators felt that the company was becoming creatively bankrupt, with 15% of the animation department resigning in 1977, following famed animator Don Bluth to a new production company he had founded. Cardwalker operated under the philosophy of "what would Walt do?", an ideology that was restraining the company from reaching new heights. One of the main issues was that in recent years, Disney had gained a reputation for making kids' movies, making them uncool in the eyes of teens. So even if certain animated movies did well, the demographic that they were appealing to was beginning to shrink. In 1983, Ron Miller became the CEO of the company, with Card remaining on the board of directors. Ron made some strides to fix Disney's reputation with teens and young adults, founding Touchstone Pictures, a new branch of the company that could make adult-targeted films without releasing under the umbrella of the Disney brand. He also established the Disney Channel to expand the company's reach further into television. As well as that, the company made big moves in the theme park business during this period, opening Tokyo Disneyland and a new version of Epcot that was reminiscent of a World's Fair. However, despite Ron's efforts, it was clear that management was allowing the company to stagnate in the absence of Walt, and those outside of the company were beginning to take notice. Because of Disney's low stock price, low amount of debt, and high value, it had become a prime target for corporate takeover. In 1984, Saul Steinberg attempted to raise his holdings in the company from 6% to 25%, putting the company in play and forcing Disney to pay him greenmail to prevent his takeover. They did this by using part of a $1.3 billion bank loan, giving the company more than $800 million in debt. They had staved off Steinberg, but there were more sharks in the water, and it seemed only a matter of time before Disney would be bought and scrapped for parts. And it was during this time that, out of those trying to take over Disney, a familiar face re-emerged: Roy Jr. Roy raised his stake to over 5%, forcing Card and Ron to admit that they had underestimated the, quote, idiot nephew. Roy was allowed to rejoin Disney as vice chairman of the board. Along with him, Roy brought Stanley Gold and his brother-in-law Peter Daly onto the board. They also planned to find a position for Gold's best friend, Frank Wells. As the sharks continued to circle around the company, Gold argued for a management review that would allow new faces in leadership positions and pull Disney from the depths it had found itself in. Miller agreed, seemingly unaware that he was the problem that they were all referring to. Miller had lost the favor of the Walt side of the family after he separated from Diane over an affair with another woman. And although they reconciled later, the period of separation was the perfect moment to unite the Disney family in pushing Ron out of the company. It would be fair to assume Roy might seek to take control for himself and lead the company to financial stability and a creative renaissance. However, Roy's ambition was not to lead the company, but rather to protect the legacy of his uncle Walt. Instead, he had someone else in mind. He picked up the phone and dialed a successful Paramount executive, a man named Michael Eisner. There were a couple reasons why Michael Eisner was an unconventional choice to lead the company. Walt Disney had grown up in Marceline, Missouri, the son of a farmer. Walt's adolescence in the small town was a time he cherished, and as he reminisced on those days in Marceline, he would learn the power of nostalgia. This would influence his work in both animation and in the design of Disneyland, particularly Main Street USA, which was patterned after Marceline. Walt and his brother Roy had worked tirelessly on their father's paper route growing up, as the Disney family was not wealthy, and everybody had to pitch in to make ends meet. Michael Eisner, on the other hand, had a very different upbringing. Eisner grew up in an apartment on Park Avenue, Manhattan, as part of a wealthy and affluent family. Eisner wore formal attire to his private school, and was expected to wear his uniform every night at the family's candlelight dinners. His father was not especially close with his children, having them refer to him by his first name, Lester. This prompted other schoolchildren to tease Michael, believing that Lester couldn't be his real father, because why wouldn't a son refer to his father as Dad? Eisner was also a surprising choice because of his extensive background in Hollywood, as at the time, the Walt Disney Company and those within saw themselves as separate from the rest of the entertainment industry. Eisner had found success at NBC, CBS, ABC, and finally as the president and COO of Paramount Pictures, gaining him the attention of Ron Miller. Miller had actually considered recruiting Eisner to run production, and later considered him for Disney's COO, but Card Walker seemingly blocked this both times, objecting to bringing an outsider to the company. Despite the rejection, it was hard to scoff at Eisner's track record. Eisner had long operated under the philosophy of making high-concept, low-budget films, meaning films with concepts that were engaging and easy to summarize, but relatively low in cost to make. He believed that rather than banking on a home run with one film, it was smarter to go for singles and doubles. However, if the concept was strong enough to demand a higher budget, Eisner was occasionally willing to deviate from this philosophy. Under his leadership, Paramount released a number of films considered classics to this very day, including Saturday Night Fever, Grease, the Star Trek film series, Footloose, and Raiders of the Lost Ark, as well as classic television series like Laverne and Shirley, Cheers, and Happy Days. So it made sense when Frank Wells suggested to Gold and Roy that they reach out to Eisner. Roy already knew Eisner well enough, as they were both on the board at the California Institute of the Arts. Wells had also briefly gotten to know Eisner when they ran into each other at a ski resort. Wells was an ambitious and adventurous man himself, known for scaling mountains in his free time. There were talks of Wells taking the CEO role, with Eisner being his number 2, but Wells repeatedly pushed for Eisner to be number 1, being content to take the second place himself. Eisner was grateful to Wells for conceding the CEO position and supporting him for the role, but it was clear that Wells preferred it this way for his own reasons. Wells had previously been pushed into a creative position during his time at Warner Brothers, and never felt comfortable making such decisions. He was better suited to handling the business and logistics side of things, and knew Disney would be better suited for a creative leader. The terms of Eisner's arrival to Disney seemed set in stone, and were coming at the perfect time. Eisner's success had been so noteworthy at Paramount that he had earned the ire of Martin Davis. Davis was the chairman of Paramount's parent company, Gulf and Western, and resented the massive amount of media acclaim Eisner had received, for some reason feeling that he deserved the attention himself. When Davis called Eisner to a meeting, Eisner could see the writing on the wall, and knew his time at the company was almost over. The meeting was supposedly to hammer out Eisner's new contract, but Davis was reducing Eisner's pay dramatically in an effort to push him out. But during the meeting, Eisner couldn't help but blurt out, quote, "I think I'm about to be offered the CEO position at Disney." Davis, surprised, responded, quote, "I won't stand in your way." Soon, the day came for Eisner to receive the offer for the CEO position at Disney. He waited, and waited. Morning turned to afternoon, which turned to evening, when he finally received a call from Wells. "How do you feel?" Wells asked. Eisner was caught off guard. "How should I feel?" he asked. "Hasn't anyone told you?" Wells realized he was breaking the bad news to Eisner himself. Miller had been fired, but the board decided to conduct an outside search for a successor. Eisner wasn't out of the running, but if he wanted the position, he was going to have to fight for it. And fight he would, because unfortunately, he had already burned his bridge at Paramount. Although the writing had been on the wall ever since Roy returned to Disney, Ron was blindsided by the realization that he was being dethroned. He had been recruited by Walt Disney himself, and dedicated his short stint as CEO to helping Disney break new ground in the entertainment industry, but ultimately, it was not enough. When he found out he was being pushed out, he burst into tears, feeling betrayed. But prior to the vote to remove him, he composed himself and appeared before the board to make one final speech. "I'm very disappointed in this. I've given my life to this company. I've never worked anywhere else. I've made progress with this company. I think I've taken great strides in leading it as far as it has come. I feel like this is a betrayal," he said, staring straight at Roy. He turned to Gold. "Don't you have anything to say, Stanley? You talk so much all the time. You're really the ringleader of this." Another jab at Roy. To Ron, it seemed impossible that the idiot nephew could really be the one leading the charge on such a coup. The board sat silently, as Ron walked out for the last time. Then, they held a vote and formally removed him as CEO. Over at Paramount, Davis pulled Eisner into another meeting and handed him the press release announcing his resignation. It was the end of the road. Eisner, fearful that Paramount would cheat him out of the remaining money he was owed on his contract, demanded a check for the full amount immediately. When he got it, he walked out of the meeting, to the confusion of everybody in the room, and went straight to his bank, demanding they deposit the funds into his account immediately before Davis could force the check to bounce. It was the last paycheck Eisner would be guaranteed for a while, and he knew it. But Wells, Gold, and Roy were not finished making their case for Eisner to join Disney, and they had just the idea for how to get him the job. They would go to every board member they could get a hold of, pitching Eisner as the ideal choice. But more importantly, Eisner would reach out to the largest individual shareholders, the Bass family. The family, led by Sid Bass, held a 5.5% stake in the company, and therefore had a good amount of influence on Disney's decision-making. Eisner got on the phone with Sid Bass and made the case for himself. Companies like Disney are always founded by creative executives, but eventually the founder dies or gets pushed out or moves on to something else. Inevitably, the business people take over, the managers, and they focus on preserving the vision that made the company great in the first place. They don't have any creative ideas themselves, and they end up surrounding themselves instead with analysts and accountants to try to control the creative people and cut costs. In the process, they discourage change and new initiatives and reinvention. In time, the company begins to ossify and atrophy and die. It's important to have financial parameters and never to bet the house, which is how we always protected Paramount. But in a creative business, you also have to be willing to take chances and even to fail sometimes, because otherwise nothing innovative is ever going to happen. If you're only comfortable running a business by the numbers, I can understand that. But then you shouldn't get involved with a creatively driven company like Disney. Eisner waited eagerly for a response. Sid thought for a moment. Then he simply said, quote, "You're right. We're with you." Soon after Eisner gave his speech, the Bass family raised their stake from 5.5% to 8.8%, further showcasing their faith in Eisner as a leader. Eisner also met with Ron Miller and Diane Disney, since the Walt side of the family held a considerable stake in the company as well. Miller asked how much Eisner would be asking for in stocks. 500,000 shares. Miller was shocked. That was an enormous amount, far more than the 25,000 he had been awarded during his time at the company. "Michael, they'll never give it to you." But Eisner shrugged. "Well, you've got to start somewhere. So," he continued, "do I have your support?" Miller was impressed by Eisner's boldness, and even more so, knew he was an excellent replacement. "You know what, Michael? You don't need it." And Miller was right. With the support of the Basses alone, Roy and Gold could threaten a proxy fight to replace any board members that refused to back Eisner's appointment. But quickly, it became apparent that this would not be necessary. Everybody on the board could already see where this was going. Even Card Walker, who had once refused to bring in Eisner, could see he had been wrong. Walker's wife spoke to Roy's wife, Patty, about Eisner, saying, quote, "I guess we bet on the wrong horse." Walker offered to make Eisner's nominating speech to the board when the time came, showing his clear endorsement. With the changes finalized, Eisner had ascended to the throne, leading the Walt Disney Company as its new CEO. Frank Wells would serve as the COO and president, reporting directly to the board. They had triumphed over uncertainty and won the trust of the board. Roy was the happiest of all, confident in his choice to place his family's company in Eisner's hands. Eisner said to Roy, quote, "You got me this job. I'll never forget it. If I ever lose your confidence, let me know and I'll resign." Roy doubted that day would ever come. But their work was just beginning. The sharks were still circling the company, and time was running short to protect Disney. Eisner and Wells had been crowned the twin kings of the Magic Kingdom, one leading creative and the other business, the same as Walt and Roy before them. Now, it was time to save the kingdom before it was too late. Next time, we'll follow Eisner and Wells as they transform Disney from the inside out, bringing in new faces, pushing old ones to the side, incorporating new technology, and doing whatever they can to raise profits. Will they be able to save Disney from impending demise, or will they go down with the sinking ship? Find out next time on Kings of the Magic Kingdom.